The morning mist clung to the Mississippi River like a shroud over the dead, and in many ways, it was. Lieutenant General Ulysses Simpson Grant stood on the bluffs overlooking the muddy waters, his weathered hands gripping the brass telescope that had witnessed more battles than most men see in a lifetime. Below him, the city of Vicksburg perched defiantly on its limestone cliffs, its cannons pointing downriver like the fangs of some ancient beast. It was May 18th, 1863, and the fate of the American Republic hung in the balance. The irony was not lost on Grant that he stood where Confederate General John Clifford Pemberton had once surveyed his domain with equal confidence. Vicksburg was more than a city, it was the key to the continent. Whoever controlled this stretch of the Mississippi controlled the lifeblood of America. Cotton, grain, and dreams flowed through these waters, and Jefferson Davis himself had declared that Vicksburg was the Gibraltar of the Confederacy. If it fell, the rebellion would be cut into like a snake severed by an axe. Grant's army had been circling Vicksburg like wolves around wounded prey for months. His first attempts to take the city had been bloody failures. The frontal assaults of May 19th and 22nd had cost him over 3,000 men, their bodies now buried in the red clay that seemed to drink blood like a thirsty god. The memory of those charges haunted him. Blue uniformed boys rushing into the maws of Confederate cannons, their battle cries swallowed by the thunder of artillery and the screams of the dying. But Grant was not a man to be deterred by failure. While other generals might have retreated to lick their wounds, he had done something that surprised even his own officers. He had decided to starve Vicksburg into submission. The siege had begun on May 25th, and now, 3 weeks later, the city was slowly dying from within. His spies reported that civilians were eating rats and hiding in caves to escape the constant bombardment. Confederate soldiers were deserting in growing numbers, their letters home intercepting by Union cavalry telling tales of hunger and despair. The strategic importance of this moment extended far beyond the bluffs of Mississippi. As referenced from Harper's Weekly Military Correspondence of June 1863, Grant understood that President Abraham Lincoln's entire war strategy depended on splitting the Confederacy along the Mississippi River. The Anaconda Plan, conceived by General-in-Chief Winfield Scott, required Union forces to squeeze the life out of the rebellion by controlling its major waterways. At ports inside Vicksburg's earthworks, General Pemberton faced an impossible choice. Confederate President Jefferson Davis had ordered him to hold the city at all costs, but his 30,000 men were trapped with dwindling supplies and no hope of relief. General Joseph Eggleston Johnston's army lurked somewhere to the northeast, but Johnston showed no inclination to risk his forces in a desperate attempt to break Grant's siege lines. The mathematics of war were simple and brutal. Pemberton's men could hold out perhaps another month, maybe less, before starvation forced surrender. As Grant lowered his telescope, he allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The noose was tightening around Vicksburg's neck, and soon the Mississippi would run freely under Union control from Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico. But he could not have known that hundreds of miles to the northeast, another drama was unfolding that would make the first week of July 1863 the most crucial period in American history. General Robert Edward Lee was marching his Army of Northern Virginia into Pennsylvania, seeking the decisive victory that might yet save the Confederate cause. While Grant's artillery thundered against Vicksburg's defenses, General Robert Edward Lee stood in the pre-dawn darkness of Pennsylvania, watching his 65,000 veterans prepare for what might be the Confederacy's last desperate gamble. It was July 1st. 1863, and the Army of Northern Virginia was deep in enemy territory, farther north than any Confederate force had ever ventured. Lee's weathered face, framed by his distinctive gray beard, betrayed none of the anxiety that gnawed at his military mind like a persistent wound. The irony of timing was lost on no one in Lee's inner circle. While Vicksburg slowly starved under Grant's relentless siege, Lee had convinced Confederate President Jefferson Davis to approve this audacious invasion of Pennsylvania. The strategy was bold in its simplicity: win a decisive victory on Northern soil, threaten Washington and Baltimore, and force Lincoln to negotiate peace before the Union could strangle the Confederacy with its superior resources. It was a gamble worthy of a riverboat captain, and Lee knew the stakes could not be higher. Lieutenant General James Longstreet, Lee's most trusted corps commander, had argued against this northern adventure for weeks. General Longstreet had said during their final council of war in Virginia, "We should be marching to Mississippi to relieve Pemberton, not dancing into Pennsylvania to court disaster." But Lee had been adamant. The Confederacy could not win. A war of attrition against the North's industrial might and immigrant swollen population. Only a crushing victory on Union soil might bring European recognition and Northern war weariness to the negotiating table. The town of Gettysburg had not been chosen for battle, it had chosen them. Like the locomotives racing toward each other on the same track, the Army of Northern Virginia and Major General George Gordon Meade's Army of the Potomac had converged on this unremarkable Pennsylvania crossroads almost by accident. Confederate General Henry Heth's division had marched toward Gettysburg seeking shoes for their barefoot soldiers, only to collide with Union cavalry under Brigadier General John Buford. What began as a skirmish over footwear was rapidly escalating into the largest battle ever fought on American soil. By mid-morning, the thunder of cannon fire echoed across the rolling farmland surrounding Gettysburg. Lee arrived to find his forces engaged in a meeting engagement that neither side had planned, but both seemed destined to fight. Through his field glasses, he could see Union soldiers taking defensive positions on the high ground south of town. Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and the ominous heights that would soon earn names written in blood: Little Round Top, Big Round Top, and Culp's Hill. The tactical situation reminded Lee of previous victories where his smaller army had defeated larger Union forces through superior generalship and the fighting spirit of his veterans. At Second Manassas, Chancellorsville, and Fredericksburg, Confederate audacity had triumphed over Union numbers. But Pennsylvania was different. Here, Lee's army was the invader, fighting on unfamiliar ground against an enemy defending their own soil. Moreover, his cavalry commander, Major General James Ewell Brown Stuart, had vanished on one of his theatrical raids, leaving Lee blind to enemy movements and intentions. As the first day's fighting intensified, Lee made the fateful decision to concentrate his entire army at Gettysburg and seek the decisive battle that had eluded him for 2 years. He sensed that Providence had presented him with an opportunity to end the war in a single stroke. Historical accounts from the Richmond Enquirer of July 1863 would later describe Lee's confidence during these crucial hours, noting how the general seemed energized by the prospect of fighting the climactic battle of the rebellion on northern soil. But 300 miles to the southwest, Grant's siege guns continued their methodical destruction of Vicksburg's defenses. While Lee prepared to assault the Union positions at Gettysburg, Pemberton's garrison grew weaker by the day. The Confederacy was about to face its greatest test on two fronts simultaneously, and the outcome of both battles would determine whether the United States would remain united or split forever into two hostile nations. The stage was set for 3 days that would reshape the American continent. Neither Lee nor Grant could have imagined how their simultaneous campaigns would intertwine to seal the Confederacy's doom. But history was about to deliver its verdict on the future of democracy itself. Dawn broke over Gettysburg on July 2nd, 1863, revealing a landscape that would soon be transformed into America's bloodiest altar. General Robert Edward Lee surveyed the Union positions from Seminary Ridge, his strategic mind calculating angles of attack, while his heart weighed the cost in Southern blood. Across the valley, the Army of the Potomac had assumed a defensive position that military historians would later describe as resembling the giant fishhook, with Cemetery Hill as the eye and Cemetery Ridge as the shank extending southward to the Round Tops. Lee's plan for the second day was characteristically aggressive. While Lieutenant General Richard Stoddard Ewell's Second Corps demonstrated against Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill, Lieutenant General James Longstreet would launch the main assault against the Union left flank. The attack would roll up the enemy line like a carpet, crushing Major General George Gordon Meade's army against the Rocky Heights, and ending the war in Pennsylvania wheat fields, still green with summer growth. But military plans, like morning mist, often dissipate under the heat of battle. Longstreet's assault, delayed by reconnaissance and troop movements, did not begin until late afternoon. When it finally came, it struck the Union line with the fury of a summer thunderstorm. Confederate brigades under Generals John Bell Hood and Lafayette McLaws crashed into the Union positions around Little Round Top and the wheat field, transforming peaceful farmland into a charnel house where boys from Alabama and Maine died within arm's reach of each other. The fighting at Little Round Top became the stuff of legend. Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's 20th Maine Regiment, down to their last cartridges, launched a desperate bayonet charge that saved the Union left flank and possibly the entire battle. In the wheat field, men fought and died over ground that changed hands 6 times, leaving it carpeted with bodies in blue and gray. The stone walls and peach orchards of peaceful Pennsylvania farms became fortifications soaked in American blood. Meanwhile, at Vicksburg, General Ulysses Simpson, Grant sensed that Pemberton's resistance was finally cracking. Confederate deserters brought daily reports of starvation within the city. Civilians had been reduced to eating mule meat, rats, and anything else that might sustain life. Grant's siege guns, including massive naval mortars borrowed from Admiral David Dixon Porter's fleet, had turned once proud Vicksburg into a rubble-strewn maze of caves and craters. The city that had once been the pride of Mississippi now resembled the surface of the moon. The psychological pressure on General John Clifford Pemberton was becoming unbearable. His dispatches to Confederate authorities, intercepted by Union intelligence, revealed a commander torn between military necessity and political impossibility. Jefferson Davis had ordered him to hold Vicksburg at all costs, but those costs were measured in the slow starvation of 30,000 Confederate soldiers and countless civilians. Pemberton knew that surrender was inevitable, but the timing would determine whether his garrison would survive to fight another day, or simply waste away to skeletons in Confederate gray. On the evening of July 2nd, as surgeons worked by lantern light to save what remained of the day's casualties at Gettysburg, Lee made perhaps the most fateful decision of his military career. Despite the mixed results of the day's fighting, despite Longstreet's concerns about attacking strong defensive positions, Lee decided to stake everything on one final assault. He would strike the center of the Union line with 15,000 men. Under Major General George Edward Pickett, Brigadier General Johnston Pettigrew, and Major General Isaac Ridgway Trimble, as documented in the Confederate military correspondence published in the Southern Literary Messenger of August 1863. Lee believed that Meade's army had been weakened by 2 days of desperate fighting, and that one concentrated blow might shatter Union morale completely. It was the kind of bold stroke that had brought victory at Chancellorsville. But Pennsylvania was not Virginia, and the Army of the Potomac was no longer the demoralized force that had fled across the Rappahannock River just 2 months earlier. The 3rd of July would dawn clear and hot, perfect weather for the climactic moment that would determine whether the American Republic would survive its greatest trial. At Vicksburg, Pemberton was preparing his final surrender terms, while at Gettysburg, Lee was preparing for the assault that would either win Confederate independence or mark the beginning of the end for the rebellion. 2 battles, separated by hundreds of miles but united by destiny, were about to reach their simultaneous climax. July 3rd, 1863, dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that seems to mock human suffering. At Gettysburg, General Robert Edward Lee stood before his assembled corps commanders in the pre-dawn darkness, his usually composed demeanor betraying the weight of decision that would either crown his military genius or condemn it to history's harsh judgment. Across Cemetery Ridge, Major General George Gordon Meade's Army of the Potomac waited behind stone walls and earthworks, their rifles loaded, and their resolve hardened by 2 days of desperate fighting. The Confederate artillery bombardment that preceded Pickett's charge began at 1 o'clock in the afternoon with a fury that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. 150 Confederate cannons, arranged in a grand battery stretching nearly 2 miles along Seminary Ridge, opened fire simultaneously in what would be remembered as the largest artillery barrage in the history of North America. The sound could be heard in Pittsburgh, and the ground trembled beneath the feet of farmers 50 miles away. Brigadier General Henry Jackson Hunt, Meade's chief of artillery, had positioned his guns to answer the Confederate bombardment with interest. 80 Union cannons replied with their own thunder, and for nearly 2 hours, the artillery duel raged across the Pennsylvania countryside like a preview of hell itself. Smoke obscured the battlefield so completely that gunners fired blind, aiming at muzzle flashes and praying their shells would find Confederate flesh rather than Pennsylvania soil. But the true horror was yet to come. At 3 o'clock, as the artillery fire slackened, 15,000 Confederate soldiers emerged from the smoke-shrouded woods of Seminary Ridge and began their mile-long advance across open ground toward the center of the Union line. Major General George Edward Pickett's Virginia Division, flanked by North Carolina troops under Brigadier General Johnston Pettigrew and Tennesseans under Major General Isaac Ridgway Trimble, stepped off in perfect alignment, their battle flags snapping in the summer breeze like the banners of medieval knights riding to their doom. The charge across that open field became the high water mark of the Confederacy. the moment when Southern independence came closest to reality before receding, forever like a tide that would never return. For the first few hundred yards, the Confederate line maintained its formation, a moving wall of gray and butternut uniforms that covered the ground like a vast, lethal carpet. But as they advanced, Union artillery began to tear gaps in their ranks, and those gaps widened with each step toward Cemetery Ridge simultaneously. 300 miles to the southwest, the final act of the Vicksburg drama was reaching its inevitable conclusion. General John Clifford Pemberton, his face gaunt with the strain of command and his uniform hanging loose on his starved frame, met with his senior officers in what remained of Vicksburg's courthouse. The building, once a symbol of Mississippi justice, now served as a bomb shelter, its walls pocked with shell fragments and its windows long since shattered by Union artillery. The mathematics of surrender are always brutal, but Pemberton faced calculations that would have challenged Euclid himself. His 30,000 soldiers were consuming the last of their rations when they had rations at all. Horses were being slaughtered daily to feed the men, and even the city's cats and dogs had disappeared into cooking pots. Medical supplies had been exhausted weeks ago, and wounded soldiers were dying from infections that proper medicine might have cured. Grant's terms, delivered by flag of truce that morning, were surprisingly generous for a Union general known for demanding unconditional surrender. According to contemporary accounts preserved in the official records of the War of the Rebellion, compiled by the United States War Department, Grant offered to parole Pemberton's entire garrison rather than march them off to northern prison camps. It was a calculated gesture of magnanimity designed to encourage other Confederate surrenders, but it also reflected Grant's understanding that the war was entering its final phase. Back at Gettysburg, Pickett's charge reached its climax. At a stone wall defended by the 2nd Corps under Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, for a few terrible minutes, Confederate soldiers breached the Union line at a point that would forever be known as the Angle. Brigadier General Lewis Addison Armistead, his hat mounted on his sword point as a guide for his men, led a handful of Virginians over the wall before falling mortally wounded with his hand on a Union cannon. It was the furthest point of Confederate advance, the literal high water mark of the rebellion. But the breach could not be held. Union reinforcements converged on the Angle from 3 directions, and the Confederate assault collapsed like a wave, breaking against an immovable shore. Of the 15,000 men who had stepped off from Seminary Ridge, fewer than half returned to Confederate lines. The flower of Virginia's manhood lay scattered across a Pennsylvania field, their blood-watering soil that would never yield to Confederate ambition. As the sun set on July 3rd, both battles had reached their decisive moments. Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania lay in ruins, while at Vicksburg, Pemberton was drafting his surrender terms. The twin disasters would prove that the Confederacy, despite its fighting spirit and military skill, could not sustain war on multiple fronts against an enemy with superior resources. An unshakable determination thought the morning of July 4th, 1863, arrived with cruel irony that would not be lost on historians for generations to come. As the United States celebrated 87 years of independence, the Confederate armies faced the bitter reality of defeat. At Gettysburg, General Robert Edward Lee's Army of Northern Virginia began its painful withdrawal toward Virginia, leaving behind 17 wagon miles of wounded soldiers and the shattered dreams of Confederate independence. Simultaneously, at Vicksburg, General John Clifford Pemberton prepared to surrender his garrison on the very anniversary of American freedom. Lee's retreat from Pennsylvania resembled a funeral procession more than a military withdrawal. The wagons carrying Confederate wounded stretched from Gettysburg nearly to the Potomac River, their occupants crying out in agony with each bump and jolt of the rough roads. Many would not survive the journey home, their bodies joining the thousands already buried in shallow graves across the Pennsylvania countryside. Lee himself, his gray uniform stained with the dust of defeat, rode among his broken columns like a patriarch leading his people into exile. The psychological impact of Gettysburg on Confederate morale was devastating. These were the same soldiers who had crushed Union armies at Bull Run, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville. They had followed Lee through 2 years of seemingly impossible victories, developing an almost mystical faith in their commander's invincibility. Now, as they limped southward through Maryland's humid valleys, that faith lay shattered like the bodies of their comrades left behind in Pennsylvania soil. Major General George Gordon Meade's Army of the Potomac followed Lee's retreat at a respectful distance, but the Union commander showed little inclination for aggressive pursuit. His own army had been bloodied by 3 days of desperate fighting, losing over 23,000 casualties from its ranks. Moreover, Meade understood that his victory at Gettysburg, while strategically decisive, had been tactically defensive. The Army of Northern Virginia, even in defeat, remained a dangerous opponent capable of turning on its pursuers like a wounded lion. At Vicksburg, the surrender ceremony began at 10 o'clock in the morning with the kind of military pageantry that attempted to preserve honor in the face of inevitable humiliation. General Ulysses Simpson Grant, showing the magnanimity that would characterize his later presidency, allowed Pemberton's officers to keep their sidearms and personal horses. The Confederate soldiers were paroled rather than imprisoned, a gesture that Grant hoped would encourage other Southern commanders to surrender, rather than prolong the bloodshed. Pemberton himself presented a figure of tragic dignity as he formally surrendered his sword to Grant. On the courthouse steps, the two men had been classmates at West Point 20 years earlier, when both were young cadets dreaming of military glory. Now they met again as opponents in a civil war that had torn their nation apart. Grant's acceptance of the surrender was brief and formal, but witnesses noted the sadness in his eyes as he watched 30,000 Confederate soldiers lay down their arms. The strategic consequences of Vicksburg's fall rippled across the Confederacy. Like an earthquake, the Mississippi River was now under complete Union control from Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico, effectively cutting the Confederacy in half. Texas, Arkansas, and western Louisiana were isolated from the rest of the Confederate states, unable to contribute their resources to the rebellion's survival. Moreover, the psychological impact was enormous if the Gibraltar of the Confederacy could fall. What Southern stronghold was truly secure? Confederate President Jefferson Davis received news of both defeats while sequestered in his Richmond office, surrounded by maps that suddenly seemed to mock Southern ambitions. Historical accounts from the Richmond Whig of July 10, 1863, describe the Confederate capital as gripped by a depression so profound that even the most ardent secessionists began to whisper of peace negotiations. The twin disasters of Gettysburg and Vicksburg had shattered the Confederacy's offensive capability and defensive confidence simultaneously. In Washington, President Abraham Lincoln received Grant's telegram announcing Vicksburg's surrender with tears of relief streaming down his weathered face. "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea," he proclaimed, paraphrasing his own earlier words about the strategic importance of the Mississippi River. Combined with Meade's victory at Gettysburg, Vicksburg's fall meant that the Union could now focus its superior resources on grinding down the remaining Confederate resistance. The international implications were equally decisive. Great Britain and France, which had been considering recognition of Confederate independence, quietly shelved their plans following news of the July disasters. European powers understood that nations which lost major battles simultaneously on multiple fronts were unlikely to achieve lasting independence. The Confederacy's hopes for foreign intervention died in the Pennsylvania wheat fields and Mississippi River bluffs. As night fell on July 4, 1863, the United States had been reborn in blood and fire. The Declaration of Independence, written 87 years earlier in Philadelphia, had been validated by Union victories that proved the American experiment in self-government would survive its greatest test, but the cost had been enormous, and the work of reunification would require years of additional sacrifice from both North and South. The weeks following the twin Confederate disasters of Gettysburg and Vicksburg witnessed the slow unraveling of Southern hopes like a tapestry pulled apart thread by thread. By late July 1863, the strategic initiative had passed irreversibly to the Union, and perceptive observers on both sides understood that the Confederacy's brief moment of potential triumph had passed forever. The rebellion would continue for nearly 2 more years, but it would be the death throes of a cause whose vital organs had been fatally wounded. During the first week of July, General Robert Edward Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, once the pride of the Confederacy and the scourge of Union generals, struggled to maintain its cohesion during the retreat to Virginia. Desertion, previously rare among Lee's veterans, began to increase as news of Vicksburg's fall spread through the ranks. Soldiers from Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana learned that their home states were now cut off from the rest of the Confederacy, accessible only through Union-controlled territory. Many simply walked away from their regiments, heading west to protect families they might never see again if they remained with Lee's army. The morale crisis extended far beyond the common soldiers. To the highest levels of Confederate leadership, Lieutenant General James Longstreet, Lee's most trusted subordinate, privately expressed doubts about the Confederacy's ability to continue the war. In letters to his wife that would later be published in the Southern Historical Society papers, Longstreet wrote of his growing conviction that the South should seek negotiated peace before its cities were reduced to rubble and its young men to corpses. President Jefferson Davis, however, remained publicly defiant despite the military catastrophes. In a speech to the Confederate Congress on August 1, 1863, Davis proclaimed that the losses at Gettysburg and Vicksburg were merely temporary setbacks that would inspire greater Southern resistance, but behind closed doors. Davis privately acknowledged to his cabinet that the Confederacy's window for achieving independence was rapidly closing. Without foreign recognition or decisive military victory, the South faced the grim prospect of fighting a war of attrition against an enemy with vastly superior resources. The economic consequences of losing the Mississippi River became apparent. Within weeks of Vicksburg's surrender, cotton from Texas and Arkansas, previously shipped east to Confederate ports, now piled up in warehouses with no means of reaching European markets. The Confederate government's finances, always precarious, deteriorated rapidly as tax revenues from the Trans-Mississippi region dried up completely. Inflation, already severe throughout the South, accelerated to the point where Confederate paper money became virtually worthless. Union strategy, meanwhile, entered a new and more aggressive phase following the July victories. General-in-Chief Henry Wager Halleck issued orders for coordinated offensives designed to prevent Confederate forces from concentrating against any single Union army. The strategic principle was simple: keep Confederate commanders separated and reactive, never allowing them the opportunity to mass forces for another offensive. Like Lee's Pennsylvania invasion. In the Western Theater, General Ulysses Simpson Grant found himself elevated to hero status throughout the North. His success at Vicksburg, combined with his earlier victories at Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, and Shiloh, established him as the Union's most successful field commander. Newspapers that had previously criticized Grant's drinking and unconventional methods now praised his tenacity and strategic vision. According to contemporary accounts in Harper's Weekly of August 15, 1863, Grant was already being mentioned as a potential successor to the ineffective General-in-Chief Henry Wager Halleck. The psychological impact of the July defeats reverberated through Confederate society like aftershocks from a great earthquake. Women who had sent their sons and husbands to war with flowers and kisses now gathered in church circles to pray for peace rather than victory. The romantic vision of Confederate independence, sustained by early victories and Northern military ineptitude, gave way to the harsh reality of industrial warfare against a more powerful opponent. Confederate General Joseph Eggleston Johnston, commanding forces in Mississippi, found his position untenable following Vicksburg's fall. His army, which had failed to relieve Pemberton's garrison during the siege, now faced the prospect of Grant's victorious forces turning east toward Alabama and Georgia. Johnston began a series of strategic withdrawals that would characterize Confederate strategy for the remainder of the war, trading space for time, in the hope that Northern war weariness might yet bring political salvation. The international community's reaction to the July battles effectively ended Confederate hopes for foreign intervention. Lord Palmerston's government in London, which had been preparing legislation to recognize Confederate independence, quietly shelved the proposal following news of Lee's defeat at Gettysburg. Similarly, Napoleon III's government in France, already committed to its Mexican adventure, decided that backing the losing side in the American conflict would serve no useful purpose. By August 1863, thoughtful observers could see that the Confederacy had entered its final phase. The rebellion would continue with desperate courage and occasional tactical success, but the strategic initiative had passed to Union forces that were growing stronger, while Confederate resources dwindled. The twin victories of Gettysburg and Vicksburg had not ended the Civil War, but they had determined its ultimate outcome, as surely as if Jefferson Davis had signed surrender documents in Richmond. As autumn painted the Virginia countryside in shades of gold and crimson, the full magnitude of July's twin disasters became inescapably clear to Confederate leadership. The Army of Northern Virginia, once the invincible spearhead of Southern independence, had been reduced to a defensive force capable only of protecting Richmond and the remaining Confederate heartland. General Robert Edward Lee, his hair now completely gray and his face etched with lines of perpetual worry, understood that his strategic options had narrowed to a single, desperate choice: fight a delay in action and hope for Northern war weariness. To bring political salvation, the cascading effects of Vicksburg's surrender continued to weaken Confederate resistance. Throughout the autumn of 1863, General Ulysses Simpson Grant, now commanding all Union forces between the Appalachians and the Mississippi, began the systematic conquest of Confederate territory that would characterize the war's final phase. His success at Vicksburg had proved that Confederate strongholds, no matter how well fortified or strategically positioned, could be reduced by patient siege warfare and superior resources. Confederate attempts to regain the initiative met with consistent failure. General Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee, retreating from its defeat at the Battle of Stones River earlier in the year, suffered another crushing reverse at Chickamauga in September, followed by total disaster at Chattanooga in November. Each Confederate defeat opened new avenues for Union advance while further depleting Southern manpower that could never be replaced. The economic strangulation of the Confederacy accelerated throughout the latter half of 1863. With the Mississippi River under complete Union control, the Trans-Mississippi Confederacy became increasingly irrelevant to the rebellion's survival. Texas cattle and Louisiana sugar could no longer reach Confederate markets, while manufactured goods from the industrial East could not penetrate Union naval blockades. The Confederate economy, always dependent on agricultural exports, collapsed under the twin pressures of military occupation and naval strangulation. President Abraham Lincoln's political position, precarious following 2 years of military reversals and mounting casualties, was dramatically strengthened by the July victories. The Democratic Party's peace faction, which had gained strength during the dark days of 1862, found their arguments undermined by clear evidence of Union military superiority. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, controversial when issued in January 1863, gained popular support as Union victories demonstrated that slavery's destruction was both militarily necessary and morally justified. The international implications of Gettysburg and Vicksburg extended far beyond North America's borders. European observers recognized that the United States, despite 4 years of civil war, had demonstrated industrial and military capabilities that rivaled any global power. Britain's traditional policy of maintaining American weakness through division was abandoned in favor of maintaining good relations with what would clearly emerge as a unified and powerful nation, as documented in contemporary analyses from the Times of London in September 1863. British policymakers began planning for post-war commercial relations with a reunited United States. Confederate morale, the invisible force that had sustained Southern resistance through 2 years of increasingly desperate warfare, finally began to crack under the weight of accumulated disasters. Desertion rates increased dramatically throughout the autumn, particularly among soldiers from the Trans-Mississippi states, who had no hope of seeing their families again while serving in Virginia or Tennessee. Entire regiments simply melted away, their members heading home to protect families and property from Union occupation forces. General Lee himself, in private correspondence with Confederate Secretary of War James Alexander Seton, acknowledged that the Confederacy's position had become untenable following the July defeats. Lee's letter of November 15, 1863, preserved in the official records, expressed his conviction that the South could no longer hope for military victory and should consider negotiated peace before its remaining resources were exhausted completely. The strategic revolution initiated by Grant's Vicksburg campaign and consolidated by Meade's victory at Gettysburg had fundamentally altered the character of the Civil War. What had begun as a conflict between roughly equal opponents had become a systematic conquest of a weaker power by a stronger one. Union forces, their confidence restored by success, pressed forward on all fronts while Confederate armies fell back toward their final strongholds around Richmond, Atlanta, and Mobile. By December 1863, perceptive observers understood that the American Civil War had entered its final phase. The Confederacy would continue to resist with the courage of desperation, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The twin victories of July had broken the back of Southern resistance, splitting the Confederacy geographically while destroying its offensive capability and international credibility. The Mississippi River, whose control had been the strategic objective of Grant's entire campaign, now flowed unvexed to the sea as Lincoln had prophesied. From Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico, Union gunboats patrolled waters that had once carried Confederate commerce and military supplies. The great river that had divided the continent now united it under federal authority, serving as a highway for Union reinforcements and supplies flowing south to complete the work of reconstruction and reunion. The Confederate States of America, born in Montgomery in February 1861 with such hope and determination, had received its death warrant during the first week of July 1863. The formal surrender would not come until April 1865 at Appomattox Courthouse, but the Confederacy's fate was sealed when Pemberton's garrison marched out of Vicksburg, and Lee's broken army retreated from Gettysburg. The United States, tested by fire and proven in blood, would emerge from its greatest trial as a truly united nation, ready to take its place among the world's great powers.